against my enemies, yeah.
What is up, everyone? I am Rob.
I'm Eamon.
Damn, son, it is Monster Fuzz.
A very special Monster Fuzz.
Very special Monster Fuzz. Back by popular demand, folks. You will have seen the episode title. Basically, Brother Richard, when he came on the podcast, everyone was like, we need more Brother Richard. That was a really good episode. And so, because we're doing this whole 7 days of Samhain thing, it made sense to get Brother Richard on. Because, again, he has a lot of good stories for this time of year. Yeah. A lot of good insight for this time of year.
A lot of stuff. Stuff that I would imagine barely anyone, if anyone, will know about.
Halloween's not pagan.
Of Halloween, yeah.
Shots fired.
Like, we were like, do you think it's metaphysical? And he was like, I think it could be 7 different things. Like, how many? This is a very informative. This is like might win you the trivia prize at a pub quiz someday.
It was a very good episode. Lots of that stuff again. Like we were under the impression of Halloween being a pagan thing, and Brother Richard's take on it is that it isn't. So basically, he offers another theory. I haven't done enough looking into it myself to even draw my own conclusion. But Brother Richard sounds very factual and informative.
Where Brother Richard describes something to you or explains it to you, you don't have to do your own research because he is a reliable source. That's my reading of everything he said to us.
That's true. But yeah, fantastic chat. We won't waffle on anymore about it, folks. And as well, check out the Capuchin Order. Check out on Google if you're looking for it. We don't have the exact website link here, so search the Capuchins in Dublin, and you can donate to their cause. They do great work.
His particular one, they have, I think their headquarters, their base of operations is Church Street in Dublin. So that's the one you want to.
Yeah, so head on over and drop him a few bob. And as well, Brother Richard has a new book out. We'll put the link in the description if you want to check that out. Very good read. We picked up a couple of copies as well. So head on over, check all that out. And without further ado, it is Brother Richard. Brother Richard, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's always a privilege.
It is, yeah, it's cool. We had to get you back pretty soon because after the first episode, everyone was like, Brother Richard needs to come back on the podcast soon. I really enjoyed the interview. So we were like, Halloween's
Happy
coming.
to be here.
Yeah, it's cool, man. And I think a lot of people got a lot of different things from that first chat, and I know we did. We were super buzzing after the conversation. We really enjoyed it. But before we get into this episode, I'd just like to say congratulations as well on your book launch. I understand it did quite well, so congrats on that.
You're very kind. Yeah, thank you. It's doing its job out there, and it's out in the wild, as they say now at this stage. So I can let it go and let it move and do what it does. And I'm happy to let it go at this point. There comes a moment. An old teacher of mine many years ago said, "A work of art is never finished; it's only ever abandoned." So I'm perfectly happy to abandon it at this stage. On to the next thing. Yeah,
for sure. So today, I suppose we're going to have a sort of a general chit chat. Obviously, Halloween is coming very soon. I'm actually curious to know what your take on Halloween is as a man of, you're obviously of Catholic faith. What does it mean to you as an Irish person as well? Because obviously there's a deep sort of a pagan tradition behind it and stuff like that. What do you get from it? What way do you interpret it? All that kind of thing.
So I begin by challenging the assumption that it's pagan. That's the first thing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the first thing. So the earliest records of Halloween as such are actually Christian.
Okay. Do tell.
So you have this extraordinary circuit, this kind of circle that takes place. So recently I gave a lecture actually on the history of Halloween to the Brazilian community here in Dublin. Which was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. And the reason was that their chaplain was very worried about the Brazilians being contaminated by the Halloween end of things. Because as far as he was concerned, it was coming from the Americas, and over there it's viewed by the Christian world as kind of with great suspicion because it's seen as paganism. And I was like, hold on a second. This comes out of the very early Celtic Christian tradition. So Halloween, obviously, even its name is All Hallows Eve, and it was the vigil into the Feast of All Hallows. So this time of year, obviously there's the Celtic Samhain, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That's slightly different. And it's a combination of those two that does make modern Halloween what it is. But in terms of the historical understanding, the folkloric understanding of what it is, it comes out of the mumming tradition, which was the idea within the Christian medieval world that there was an element of chaos that was kind of brought in prior to the celebration of a big liturgical feast. Oh. You get the Feast of Fools of December before Christmas. You get the various Maundy stuff that's done just before Easter. And then you have the April Fools that's still with us to this day before the spring feasts. And then there was All Hallows Eve. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind it was this was the Christian tradition saying to the pagan tradition, we are not afraid of anything that you offer. Oh. And so the mumming, dressing up as ghosts and witches and monsters and the dead, was actually to poke fun at these elements. Oh. And to say that those who were within the Christian tradition had nothing to fear of that stuff, and we could actually kind of mock it to its face. Now, it was in a childish understanding of that, okay? This is not your politically correct, we're all, is back when, it was about kind of gaining territory and ceding territory, etc. So you have that's the first element, okay? Then you have the Irish element, which is very different. So the Irish element, Ireland, in terms of its kind of conversion to Catholicism or to broad Christianity, because there was only one strain of Christianity at the time, essentially it takes on the understanding of the kind of what they called the logios spermatakoi in Greek, which was the idea that seeds of the divine word are present in all the traditions and in all the religions, and that these have been left there by angelic presences, by divine dispensation, so that when the word, the gospel, is actually announced, the people of those traditions would recognize it for the truth. And that also meant, though, that all that was true, beautiful, and good in those traditions was to be kept. It wasn't to be gotten rid of. It wasn't to be burned or destroyed or anything else. So you have the first generation after Patrick being told, what we call the post-patrician era, being told, baptize the holy wells, honor the holy trees, make sacred the groves that where the ancestors were venerated, but use all of these things to teach the faith as well. In Ireland, you get this very, some would say almost syncretistic kind of understanding of the tradition. And with that's where Samhain then, as an ancestor and a harvest festival, begins to mix in with the All Hallows Eve idea. So you have All Hallows Eve, which is honouring the hallowed dead. So the first 2 days of November, the first day are the saints, the hallows, those who are already holy. And the second day then is All Souls, which is praying for those who are saved but are still on the way, the purgatorial souls. And they would be within the Christian tradition, the understanding of a ghost proper. So you have these 3 days that then fall exactly where Samhain fell as well. And you have this idea of harvest and the harvesting of the dead and the transition and the place where the veils are thin and the time when the souls can appear. And all of this stuff gets molded and melded and becomes the kind of modern Halloween. And then the Americans take it and mess it up completely.
Yeah. As they often do.
Yeah.
Well, the only credit I will give to the Americans for Halloween is realizing that carving a pumpkin is far easier than carving a turnip.
That's right. That's true. Yeah.
And so we ended up with the pumpkin lantern rather than the turnip lantern. But a lot of the kind of the sort of idea that Halloween is the time when sort of evil reigns. It was exactly the opposite. Oh. Exactly. So the opposite was the idea that this was when the holy ancestors walked the earth, and this is when the family. And so if you go even 2 generations ago, and I wrote a poem about this even in terms of, because my own grandmother, this is the way she celebrated it, was the house had to be cleaned on Halloween. Because it's the night that the ancestors would visit. There were 2 nights in the year when the ancestors were expected to visit. One was Halloween and one was Christmas Eve. Okay. So you cleaned everything out. You put a lamp or a fresh fire in the grate. We always had to leave out brown bread and salt in the in the fireplace, and that was for them, and water, fresh water, and that was for them to come and receive nourishment. You told stories and all the rest of it, but then the main room was left alone. You closed it off and you left it there for the night. And the following morning then, the bread and the salt couldn't be used for anything except sprinkled on the land. It was given back to the land then at that stage. So there are elements then, you can see why people think, oh, that's very pagan, but actually it goes very, very ancient Roman rituals of the dead that were taken on by the early Christians and sort of sanctified. So the Romans used to go to their tombs around this time of year, the family tombs, and they were built above ground. They were big boxes. And you went up to the roof and you had a picnic with the dead.
Okay.
And it was a little chute, a little hole at the side.
Still
and when
done
you
in some cultures, I think, right? I think in Indonesia or somewhere like that, they do the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah,
you feed the dead, clean their bones, do all of that kind of stuff along there. And a lot of the cult of relics came out of that as well. So there is this... if you don't know history, unfortunately, you kind of lose where it is, and you'll just accept what Google tells you. And Google will tell you, the most popular answer, not actually the right answer.
That's true. That's true.
That's where it comes from. So Halloween is a big thing for us. We celebrate it really well. It's the one day of the year when nobody looks sideways at a monk walking down the street. So they just it's fantastic.
Yeah. How did the Brazilians take the news?
They were delighted. Because they could have a party. Once you say to any Brazilian, Latin American, Central American that there's another possibility for a party, like they're in.
they do love a party. Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
funny. It's funny you mention it, and just you were saying the priest was a bit worried about saying it was pagan in nature. When my wife's from Sao Paulo and we would visit her family a couple of years back.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
But we were going through, she was showing all the pictures, and here we are now in Phoenix Park, and isn't this great? And we're drinking, there's a bag of Tato, you won't believe how nice they are, all that. But there was one, we went to a Halloween show. So we're all dressed up. I had a bit of face paint on, and she had, those like Maleficent sort of ears, if you like. Yeah. And as soon as I flicked on it, her mum had turned away for a second, and she just immediately took the phone out of my hand and sort of flicked past all the ones where she had the horns on, because she was like, no, if you show that to my mother now, that'll be a serious thing, So I can kind of get where he was coming from.
Well, tell her if her mum wants a lecture anytime, there's no problem. We'll have one ready. That's fine.
I think her mum's leading on the lecture front these days.
The mothers usually do. They're pretty good at it. There's no issue with it at all. If we actually celebrated it the way it was supposed to be celebrated, obviously there's, with sometimes even around here, sometimes it can get a bit wild in terms of drink and drugs and violence and stuff like that. And that was never what it was supposed to be. It was always around a childish thing, and it was also the kind of folk magic-y stuff that was often wound around faith. I mean, even down to things like the ring in the barn brack and telling the future with the matches and all that kind of stuff. And it was, though I must say, I have to tell you this, I was listening to your episode with Tim where you were talking about that ritual. Was it the Three King ritual or something?
The Three Kings, yeah.
And the following day I was giving a lecture there in the country. Put me up in this old country hotel, and I arrived to the room to discover that the room was set up with the one armchair in the room and 3 large mirrors set up around it. And at that point, I was like, no, this is not making sense. So,
that's a bit, that's a strange coincidence.
Right? It was within 24 hours of listening to that. So I just smiled. I'm thoroughly blessed. And I went to bed. That was the end. That was the end of that. But
because that's unusual, even having that many mirrors in a room, right? Like, so that's a very strange coincidence.
Strange. Yeah. I phoned my sister and said, look, you'd be traveling much more than I would, and kind of showed her a video of the room and said, what do you think? And she's like, oh, I don't like that. I said, no, I don't like it either. So that was it. It was rather odd, but anyway, there we go.
Yeah. So how does a Capuchin monk, or indeed just Brother Richard, celebrate Halloween on Halloween Day?
So I will do the same things that we usually do. So the same timetable is followed, but in the evening we'll keep vigil. So each of us in our own room has our own little kind of meditation altar space, and there I love photographs of some of the older generations of the family and some of the things that belong to them, and I will put out the bread and the water and the salt as we've always done, and there'll be a candle lit in the window for the night, and I'll invite them to come and visit if they want to come and visit, and or if they're allowed to visit, and they keep an eye on kind of what sort of synchronicities and things like that may happen over those days. And at some point over the month of November, we'll go and visit the graves of the family as well, and also the graves of the brothers. So tomorrow when I go to Donegal, we have a graveyard of some of our brothers up there. There's about 30 of them buried up there in where the friary is, going back to the early 1900s. And we'll celebrate a little vigil there for them as well in the midst of it all as we're coming into this kind of time of year. So it's just about remembering, and making it present again, and recognizing that this world and the next world are all one world, really. There's no real separation. There's just kind of sensory veils between here and there. So
a little sort of side question there. What I was taught by a Christian brother, but he wasn't a monk. What's the difference between Christian brothers and non-monk Christian brothers? Is there
okay? Yeah, very, very simple. Very simple. So the Christian brothers, presentation brothers, those kind of groups, they belong to what's called an apostolic congregation,
right?
Which is a group of men or women in the sisterhoods they take their vows to do a particular work. Oh. So with the Christian brothers, it was teaching and the education of the young. It might be, say, nursing with some of the sisters, or whatever. Whereas the monastic orders are much older, and they go back. We go right the way back to, in our uttermost foundation, to about the 3rd century or so, and it's founded more on the interior work of contemplation, meditation, and prayer, and then out of that may come particular work or service. But we're not bound to one particular work. And the other difference then is that Christian brothers, those brothers, they would take their vow. The vows that they take are temporary vows that are renewed sometimes every year, sometimes every 3 years. Whereas we take our vows for life then after when the training has been completed. So they're the main
in
difference.
That the Christian brothers would possibly move on to a different way of, like, if education was something.
Yeah, some of them do, or some of them would move on to other things, other work or whatever. Yeah.
Okay, but you stay sort of under with the organization.
No, not necessarily. Okay. Yeah, no, but not necessarily. No, I mean, some of them would leave and return to lay life or whatever.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Whereas as ourselves, we would normally at least, I mean, is like getting married. You get married, presuming on the day that you get married that you're going to be married for good, but understand as well that in human life, different circumstances can happen, and things may happen where someone leaves along the way. But there's no negativity in that, as long as the person has kind of decided positively that this is something that needs to happen.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I did try to float something similar with my wife. I said, we'll do a 5-year contract, and we'll see. she wasn't into it at all now. No.
Yeah. Well, the next time her mother is lecturing you can bring that up as well and see what happens.
Yeah. So one thing we're going to ask you about, because we think Brother Richard will have a better answer than us about it, is the metaphysical, in particular. Well, metaphysical Bigfoot comes up a lot on this podcast. It's a bit of a sort of Eamon is a metaphysical Bigfoot guy.
Yeah, we it's funny, we did an episode. We just recorded it last night, but it's not out. But it was about the Illuminati and the lizard people, various conspiracies behind this. And I was kind of like, yeah, it's all just a bit ridiculous, isn't it, when you think about it? Like, and then I kind of went, although I do fully believe in metaphysical Bigfoot as well. So objectively, I'm kind of at odds with myself.
So basically, I suppose first off, for our listeners, how would you describe something that is metaphysical, as you know, just for the layperson? Because a lot of people listening are probably like, what even is a metaphysical Bigfoot?
Okay, well, I suppose I'm not even sure if metaphysical is the right word, but it's essentially we're talking about a kind of a fusion. So the idea, there are 3 basic theories of this. One is a spiritual entity that from time to time gathers matter and creates a physical materiality. So in other words, you could touch it, you could smell it, you would not know that it was anything other than a physical being in this world, right? That's the first way. The second way is some kind of spiritual entity that is able to project into this world the appearance of something physical, etc. So to your senses, it would still seem physical, but it may not necessarily be physical. So it would look, to all intents and purposes, as though it is real. But you would have the situation where, say, if you tried to lean on it or whatever, you would just lean through it. Okay, that's number two, a kind of apparition. And then you have the third element, which is what we call visio intellectus, which is the idea of a spiritual entity that projects into your mind the experience of something physical. But as far as you're concerned, it has happened utterly physically. But anybody who was around you that isn't included in the visio intellectus doesn't see it or perceive it in any way, shape, or form, or may receive something completely different. We mentioned Tim earlier that famous story of the person who saw the black Bigfoot and the person who saw the white Bigfoot at exactly the same time. So that's visio intellectus. One of the ways I usually describe that is like putting a filter on your phone. Those filters that pop a ghost in the room with you, or a dog in the room with you. If somebody is looking beyond the phone, they don't see that. But if they look on the phone, they see something that looks remarkably real. So these are three kind of classical understandings of how a spiritual entity may actually work in terms of bringing things together. So that's a spiritual entity. The other possibility is, philosophically, we talk about the ladder of being, that there are different levels from totally divine to totally material or totally earthly. And that all of these levels have consciousness of a particular kind, but a consciousness that is appropriate to their level of being. So within the Judeo-Christian understanding, we would say that there are four levels of consciousness within every human being. Okay, there is the physical level of consciousness, the level of consciousness that just looks after breathing and living and being, etc. And that's the most basic level. We would call that the what was that called again? It was kind of the animal soul, the sort of the biological soul. Then you have, that's the plant soul, the botanical soul. So then you have the bit that's about desiring and appetites and all of that kind of stuff. And that will be the animal soul, the thing that motivates you. I'm too hot, I'm too cold, I'm hungry, I'm not, etc. And then you have the third level up, which is the rational soul. And the rational soul then is the human bit that actually, can use the imagination. So imagination, memory, will, and understanding would all be faculties of the rational soul. And then you have the furthest bit up, which is what we would call the pneumatic soul, or the spiritual soul, which is the point of divine presence within the human being that holds them in existence. Okay, so we have control over rational, animal, and plant, if you like, or the kind of the basic levels. We don't have control over the divine presence within us in that sense. And at death, it's believed that the animal soul and the botanical soul disappear. They pass back into nature. And it's only the rational soul, which is the individual personality, that moves on at that stage. And it moves on, still holding within itself the point of divinity, but separate from the divine in the sense that we're not one with at that point. So anyway, that gets more and more complicated. But the idea of the level of the levels along the way are to say, okay, so you have divinity, you then have the angelic world, which are entirely spiritual, okay? And then that includes both negative and positive. But then there was always the understanding amongst the philosophers and theologians that there was probably other levels between the human being, who's kind of 50-50, and the angelic, who are, 100% spiritual. And that was often where things like the Fae or elemental ideas, they were sort of placed there as well. And you would also have what we call divine emanations were often put there. So things like perceiving divine action or angelic action, but as a lesser personality. So I'm not sure if you've come across say, for example, Tolkien's famous vision of the guardian angel. His vision of the guardian angel is that the human being is a dust mote in a beam of light, and it's only when the beam of light shines on it that you see the dust mote. The beam of light is divine presence holding it in being, and the glow of the light is the angel, and the dust mote is the human being. So they're all involved in this continuum of existence while all being separate at the same time. So getting back to our Bigfoot friend, you can see that as arising in one of two directions. If you take the ladder of being, either it is an elemental, so something that is arising as a kind of a consciousness of the earth or a consciousness of the wild or anything like that along the way, and that would parallel a lot of what the kind of indigenous peoples would talk about when they talk about Bigfoot as being kind of like a guardian of the wild or that kind of thing. And then you have the other direction, approaching it from the other direction, which is a spiritual entity that assumes a physicality, or that is existing in a kind of a both and idea. The final piece on this, and then we can chat about it. The final piece on this then is also, if you want to bring in the sort of demonic or diabolical end of things along the way, was the understanding in the medieval end of things that the demonic can also, and I'm not talking about demons per se, I'm talking about that which would tend towards evil, that they can, when they are permitted to, or if they wish within limited powers, that they can form bodies for short periods of time and hold the body in existence through their will. But the problem is they can't do it for long. And as a result, it will disappear very quickly, dissipate very quickly. And the signal for this, that you were experiencing this, was there was supposed to be a terrible smell of decay associated with it. And that it would leave mucus, it would leave traces like dirty footprints, it would leave a bad smell, or you'd often find heaps of rotting matter afterwards, which were actually the leaf moldy, mattery stuff. And so in the magical tradition, one of the things that you had was magicians offering organic substances to these spirits so that they could then use them for building bodies and being more active. And that's where things like blood and milk and meat and semen and things like that were offered to these entities so that they could then use them. It had to be stuff that had life energy in it, that they could use it then, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so metaphysical Bigfoot is a much question than people think it is.
It's funny because so many of the reports of Bigfoot, there's like this terrible smell, and you kind of assume, oh well, maybe it's a wild animal, and obviously that probably doesn't smell great. And I know there's a lot of people as well, the lights that are found with it, and the gate closing. That's one I've heard a few times, and people, there's different ways. Some people say, well, it could be a portal, blah blah blah, but if it is something manifesting into our reality somehow, that it can create a sound like that, would that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've everything from the wood knocking being, I mean, Ron Moorhead, the famous Sierra Sounds man, he is now convinced that the wood knock sound is actually them popping in and popping out, you know, that there's an explosive thing. And that's very similar to a study that was done on poltergeist sounds. And what they discovered with that was, it was a study done back in the late 70s, early 80s, where there were bangs and you know, noises like that, knocking and banging. They went and recorded these, and what they discovered, as far as I remember now of the study, was that these were not explosive sounds, they were implosive sounds, which really sort of upset the kind of scientists who were expecting, you know, that this was an energy exploding out, which is how we would normally hear sound. And instead, they were actually it was sound collapsing in on itself, as far as I understand. There's also the famous story of Adam Davies. You come across him, have you? Adam Davies, the cryptozoologist guy.
Maybe we've probably read out the name, but I'm not too sure about the story. Maybe when you tell us now, it might be familiar.
Very interesting guy. So he was a complete flesh and blood Bigfoot person. I mean, he has really, you know, but he had this extraordinary experience, which he records, which included lights and portals opening and what he called demonic Ewoks appearing.
Sounds scary.
And it was very interesting that they spent the entire night, himself and another guy, while everybody else in the camp slept and were unwakeable, trying to shut this down. And so these things would make a run for them, and they found that when they put torches on them fully, the light would then collapse the portal, and then the whole cycle would start all over again. It's a fascinating thing. And to be fair to him, he's been completely honest around, look, I am a flesh and blood Bigfooter, and I have no idea what this is, or even if it relates to the Bigfoot phenomena.
Yeah, and that's such a dangerous thing to say. If you're known for the kind of flesh and blood Bigfoot, they hate when you go down the other way.
This stuff will mess with you, you know. And then you have somebody like the British Cryptozoological Association crowd. I mean, they've basically set up a whole thing around the woodwows, the British experience of the wild man, and they're very strong on this. Is not a Bigfoot, this is a woodwows, and you're kind of like, okay, but it's the same. Like, it really is the same thing. It's just a different word.
Happens. We've come across it over the years. Like, it's funny because, you know, when we started the podcast, we would have been probably just aware of Bigfoot as the American sort of phenomena. And then over the years, you know, you'll do different notes. And like only recently, we've talked about it as well recently on the pod, but we actually decided to check out like what comes out of China, for example, because China is one of these countries where it's actually quite hard to find a lot of their resources online, right? Because not only is there a language barrier, but also they're a bit sort of like a walled garden kind of thing. But in like when I went looking, like there's a whole Chinese Bigfoot is the Aaron, I think he's called, in China. And all of the stories that come out of there are so similar to the North American stuff. And you'd have to imagine, especially at the time, a lot of these stories you can kind of pin, like, or at least I used to, it was kind of like a media sensation where, you know, there was these explorers / adventurers, they'd go off and they'd find something and, you know, other people would try and copycat it. But the stuff in China was probably happening totally independently. It was at a time when there was the language barrier was even more difficult to get past, and culturally there wouldn't have been much rub off each other. So like it was so fascinating to find out that they had basically a whole wild man thing, a whole Bigfoot thing. And I suppose then that, in a sense, if you go further back to the Native American people, the First Nations people, a lot of people say that they did originally come from Asia. So then you're wondering, like, did they carry over that folklore, or indeed was there something back then that they were experiencing in Asia that didn't make it across a land bridge to North America, even if you want to stay in the physical Bigfoot kind of camp?
But speaking of that connection, the Asian connection, there's a wonderful, I've some good friends in the Tibetan Buddhist community, and they tell the lovely story of when the Karmapa, who is one of the chief teaching lamas within their tradition, he's kind of like number 2, number 3 to the Dalai Lama, but he visited with some of the Native American tribes. I'm not going to name the tribe because I can't remember, and I don't want to name the wrong tribe. But when they met, he met with the chief medicine person of their tradition. There was one of these kind of meetings, and he was invited along. And the first thing they did was to take 2 little silver boxes out of their pockets and pass them to each other. Oh. And then they were both wearing turquoise rings, which were of the same design, and they exchanged the rings. And afterwards, a reporter who'd seen this asked the Karmapa, what happened there? And he said, oh, it's fine. It's very simple. He said, about 1,000 years ago, their lineage and our lineage exchanged those boxes and rings for the first time. Wow. And now we've exchanged them again. And we'll exchange them again in 1,000 years' time. Nice. And like, through the minds of the archaeologists that... And they were like, well, yeah, they're us, we're them. You know, they've come from the same place as us, and that was it. So it's a fascinating story. I mean, I'd love to know the more about it, but like so many of these stories, it just kind of ends there. But certainly in terms of the the wild person, the wild human being, and I think Tim Renner is coming down a little bit on this as well. Is that sort of Bigfoot has the idea of, you know, the more we kind of put pressure on the wild, the wilder Bigfoot becomes. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So you can talk about him as the earth whites of Scandinavian folklore, and you can talk about the trolls. I mean, I have a picture somewhere, a painting that was done of the wood trolls from Denmark that were known for throwing stones at visitors in the woods.
Right.
At some point you have to sit down and go, look, at the very least you've got a whole load of people who learn to do the same things the same way, even if the names are different. So yeah, the more I have looked at this, the more I would come firmly down on the idea that we're really dealing with something far more metaphysical. I mean, definitely there are unknown primates to be discovered. Okay, I've no question about that. Some of our missionary brothers who were working in places like Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, etc. I mean, some of the stories they have of some of the things they saw in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, one guy talks about walking through a forest in the middle of a thunderstorm where all of the fungi in the forest just lit up and the entire forest was filled with purple light for the whole time he was there.
Wow.
And, he mentioned that and it was just a throwaway thing. And I was like, that nobody knows about that. Like, that's more like, I was on a walk, I was going from here to there and that was it, Yeah. And some animals and stuff like that they would have seen along the way. They would have no hesitation in saying that there's stuff out there that probably very rare, but isn't known about. And so, I mean, from that point of view, I think there's a lot, you have to balance that. But the idea of the kind of stuff that people talk about with regard to Bigfoot and Sasquatch, that kind of stuff, it just speaks to me more of a mythic creature than anything else.
Yeah, I must ask a question just to circle back briefly. The third manifestation of spirit, if you like, I can't remember the exact name, but it was the one where you referenced
Visio Intellectus.
Yes, thank you. And we talk about the black and white Bigfoot that manifested to the two different guys. There was a lady that I heard give a talk one day. I think it was one. Do you ever go to the moth talks? It's like people tell stories. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I've heard of them, yeah. I haven't been, but I've heard of them, yeah.
So they did it, actually did it in the Sugar Club. Used to be a relatively I think it was a monthly thing, but there was one there anyway, and it was a kind of a Halloween special. And a lady gave this really interesting story, which is quite similar. I'll get to my question, I suppose, when I tell you her story as briefly as I can. But the gist of it is that she was living in Germany, and she was in school with a friend of hers. I think it was college. And one night they were driving around. They took a wrong turn somewhere, and her recollection is that she's in the car. I believe she was in the passenger seat. The lights were shining, and so it was shining into the darkness. And what she saw was, I suppose, our kind of Western representation of the Grim Reaper come out of the shadows into the light of the car. So we had the robe and the wreath and all the rest of it, or the scythe rather, and all the rest of it. And they both looked at each other, and they obviously freaked out, reversed out, drove away. And she said that they never actually spoke about it, but she would tell the story routinely, at gatherings and Halloween type events and stuff like that. And she realized at one point, she was like, I never actually spoke to my friend about that. I never actually chased up. We just both knew we had this scary, experience, but we never spoke about it. And she wound up talking to him, and the story is exactly the same. They drive into a place, they take a wrong turn, the light's shining. But what he sees come out of the light, it's another representation of, the death figure, but it's not the representation that we're familiar with. And I can't remember what nationality the gentleman was, but whatever it was, that was their representation of death. And I was curious to get your thoughts, since the other example, say, we're talking about today is a white and a black Bigfoot. Is there potentially some kind of unifying thing there? Like, is it... What am I trying to say? Is it a thing that we perceive differently, if that makes sense?
I think I think you're into the realm of co-creation there at that stage, and the idea that the imagination as a faculty is something that seems to be accessible to a lot of these these consciousnesses or entities. So it may simply have been in the stories situation that in some way death or an experience of death or a presentiment of death, was making itself known to both of these people. So it reached into their heads and found, what she thought of as death and what he thought of as death, and then depicted death, The co-creation thing is really interesting because it becomes very important for anybody in this world, of this thing, to doubt absolutely what they are seeing. Okay. In this instance, seeing is not believing. It in fact, it's the opposite. Believing is actually seeing. You end up with the whole thing of recognizing, okay, whatever I am bringing to meet this consciousness, the likelihood is it's going to use whatever I have. So that's why we would, and indeed all of the great kind of contemplative traditions would say it's not good to go seeking spirits in that sense, because you never really know what you're seeing or what you're being told or whether it's true or not. Now there are ways of managing that, and there are ways of making things appear in their real shape, but you have to be ready to see the real shape. And sometimes human beings aren't ready to see the real shape. So sometimes this can be a kindness that's being offered to you by another consciousness. That's saying, okay, you just couldn't take seeing me as I am. So I am going to show you, something that you think works for you. And if you're out in the wild and in the in the middle of the North American forest or whatever it is, and you're aware of the fact that Bigfoot is something that is seen out here, well then, let's be a Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And if you're in the middle of a city somewhere or a town somewhere or whatever, and you need a mysterious stranger to guide you or whatever, well then the mysterious stranger turns up. The strange ones are where you get the Bigfoot turning up in the bedroom, that kind of stuff. It's almost like it's chosen the wrong set of clothes for the particular moment, or is being forced in some way to choose the wrong set of clothes. And even the whole thing of people following a particular routine, which is they have the incident. Like that, we don't talk about the incident. Then often somebody turns up who says, you must not talk about the incident. And that's actually the moment where the incident is released and gets talked about. And that's really, really fascinating, because often I really believe it can be the thing itself turning back up in another shape to say, now you need to talk about it, So where Tim talks about the... and Josh as well, in Where the Footprints End, that famous story of, the two guys who turn up after the Bigfoot sightings to say, don't talk about Bigfoot, and it was a bear and all of that kind of stuff. I found the most fascinating reaction to that was Barbara Fisher's from 6 Degrees of John Keel. So Barbara is an extraordinary folklorist. And her take on that immediately was, oh, this is the Native American story of where coyote and bear turn up to protect Sasquatch.
Right.
So that's what she saw in that. This was the archetypal figure of, you've got Coyote, the guy in the suit, the low-key kind of sharp customer, and then you have Bear, the big flannel-wearing, awkward, clumsy biker dude, Yeah. So are they human beings who are being puppeted by archetypes, or are they archetypes turning up into our world? Because we forget sometimes that a lot of the spiritual traditions, we talk psychologically about archetypes, but the spiritual traditions say, oh no, the archetypes do actually exist, and we only know them in their lesser manifestation, but in their higher manifestations they are consciousnesses themselves. So, and
there's this type, because
who knows,
and again you'll definitely be so much more versed in stuff like this, but is this where some of the Jungian ideas, I don't know much, but I know he talked about the archetypes and that cultural consciousness, collective consciousness, excuse me.
Jung is taking a lot of this from Plato. Okay, so right. So the Platonic and especially the Neoplatonic philosophy was the idea that the perfect ideas, the archetypes themselves, exist in a realm beyond our sensory apprehension, and we only know them in kind of digested experiences, the sort of shadows on the wall of the cave, that famous metaphor. So Jung takes that and then looks at it from a unconsciousness point of view. But what Jung misses out on is, because of the whole Enlightenment end of things, he's unaware of the couple of 1,000 years work of contemplative traditional work that was done on this beforehand. So there's a certain sense of having to reinvent the wheel. Right. And that's why I always think when you deal with whether it's an indigenous tradition or a native tradition or a contemplative tradition in the sense of, say, Buddhism or Christianity, either Orthodox or Catholicism or whatever, they have no problem with these things existing. Now, they might differ as to where they say they come from and all that. That's narrative, but they have no problem with them existing. The problem with existence of these things tends to come from the people who've come out of a very post-Enlightenment mindset that says there is the physical and there is the humanist spiritual. And by that, they really mean psychological. In other words, it doesn't really exist. Whereas Jung was very clear that these things do exist and that they are operating energies, operating patterns that human beings tap into from time to time. We would go further and say not only are they operating patterns within the human consciousness, but that they exist separately themselves.
That's very interesting. I was going to say as well, actually, on the topic of the monks on missions and stuff in Africa and seeing things. That's super fascinating because, again, like when we used to do notes about Bigfoot or any kind of cryptids down in Africa, a lot of the time the stories came from British explorers who were literally looking for a claim to fame, right? So they were out there. They had, they were wanting to bag a big creature that no one had ever found, and there was lots of cool stories that come out. The dinosaurs in the Congo and stuff like that, which I love. But I would love, actually, if you can root any out, or if you find any stories from monks back then, and if they had ever reported anything or seen anything.
Well, I have a wonderful connection to a piece of famous, now missing evidence. For the Mokila Mbembe, the great dynasty. Yeah. So some years ago, I was down in Tipperary and was working, giving a retreat in a monastery there that was being run at the time by a missionary order to Africa called the Rosminian Order. And it was the retirement home for their men who had served their time on the missions and had now come home. So they had a very beautiful museum of African art. The guys, had taken mementos or been given gifts or whatever, and over time this had built up big collection of stuff. So anyway, on a quiet moment, I was strolling through this, and it was all of the usual stuff you would expect. Lots of little labels giving, found here, given by so and so, etc. Typical museum. And I came around a corner and suddenly was presented with, a wooden carving of a brontosaurus.
Oh wow.
And with a strange other creature, and it looked like the two of them were trying to kind of eat each other or fight with each other or whatever. And I immediately, with all of this head on, went, where the hell did that come from? And one of the guys, the weight of that, to try and move it, to clean it, it's as far as he was concerned, it was just an awkward thing in the museum. So I said, can I see it? And he said, yeah, and handed it to me. And it was this big lump of African hardwood that had been carved in one piece.
Wow.
So I said, can I take photographs of it? And he was like, yeah, whatever you want. So I took photographs of it. And he was like, the man who brought that home, unfortunately, is dead. But he was working in West Africa, in the Congo. I was like, okay, this gets even more interesting.
Right, man, yeah.
Loads of photographs of it, and got as much information on it as I could, which wasn't very much because the guy who was in charge of it didn't know much about it. And I sent it off to... I'm not sure if you know Carl Schuker. He's a cryptozoologist in the full zoological end of things. But anyway, he's a friend of. He's written about a lot of these kind of possible extinct animals that are really still alive and things like that. Fascinating guy, PhD in zoology, comparative zoology, all of that. So I sent it to him, and he nearly exploded on spot and said, this is like we've been looking for, because the big thing was, where is the art? If this thing actually exists, where is the art? So I said, look, this is all the information I have. I sent it to you. And he said, well, could you possibly, the next time you're going there, could you try and find out, would they sell it? Would they get rid of it? The whole thing was to catalog it and find out more. So I said, sure, but I won't be there for about another 6 months or so. So about 3 or 4 months later, I'm reading one of our kind of Catholic periodicals, and I discover, the Rosminians are pulling out of the house there.
Oh, wow.
And downsizing, and they're giving it over to a new Christian community who are going to use it for retreats. And I was like, okay, it's still safe. I can still go there at some stage. So a couple of months later, I met the leaders of this group who had taken over the retreat. And I was kind of saying to them, what happened to the Museum of the African Art? And they said, they left all that behind. So I said, it's still there. And they're like, no, we wanted the space. So we just cleared it all out and gave it to a charity shop.
Oh, no.
Whoa. And I was like, regardless of that piece, I said, this was absolutely priceless collection of ethnographic art that had been built up over about 200 years, like pre-colonial right the way through. And they were like, some of the girls didn't like the masks. They kind of scared them. So they said, we take it all down, and we just gave it to a charity shop.
Oh, wow.
And that was the last that was ever heard.
So, to be fair now...
So I have the photo. I'll send you.
Yeah, do.
I'll send you the photograph of the piece.
I was going to say Tipperary is probably the closest place to the Congo in Ireland, so it's a good fit to spend the last to retire.
But this is the thing. It's the thing of we don't know what's out there, because again, if your job is, you're passing through, whether it's Ireland or Africa, and you have a different job that's not about that stuff. That stuff just becomes the background noise, the funny thing, the odd thing that happened along the way, unless you have people who go, actually, that's really important. And the one thing it taught me then was, on that day when I held that piece in my hands, there and then I was about to say to the guy, look, could I take this to actually get it scanned properly and looked at? And he would have said yes, no problem.
Yeah.
But I was like, I need to go back and do the other lecture, and I can get it again. And so it taught me a lot, which was like,
how long ago would this have been?
This is about maybe about 6 to 10, I'd say. Carl recorded it. It's in his big book of what's it called? Prehistoric survivors. He has this evidence for prehistoric survivors. And it's there. The photographs are there, and so it's my one contribution to the story of Mokila Mbembe.
Wow,
incredible. There you go.
That's and that does show you're dead right about the whole. Because you had a sort of an interest in it, and then perhaps other people that were just in that place, they were just walking by it every day and kind of had almost disregarded it. One man's trash is another man's treasure, kind of thing. And it just goes to show you, like, absolutely, for any of our listeners, if they're in a charity shop in Tipperary, they might find
check was it north or south Tip. We might take a trip.
I keep thinking of somebody has it on a mantelpiece somewhere, or it's in. Look, the cool dinosaur, So if people are out there and they know of anybody that has stuff like that, and it's also the thing to say to people out there, like, check your stuff, like, check the stuff that has come down, because you never know the stories behind things. It's always good to sit down with Great Granny and find out the stories before Great Granny is gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I have to remind myself, and I tell this story pretty much every Halloween. And when you were talking about carving turnips, it reminded me about my granddad often tells, like, they used to do cabbage stump night at Halloween, which is where they basically used to just fire cabbage stumps at people's doors and run off. But like, he was born in 1935 and he's still with us. So to get his stories, but then he tells me about his grandparents. And his grandparents, would have been born in like 1850s, something like that. And you're like, it's
you're back 6 generations, yeah.
And you just sometimes you kind of, in a way, you take it for granted because you're like, wow, this is like a living, breathing piece of history there. Like, you're chatting to him sometimes, and just the day-to-day discussions, like he talks about, even just remembering the old funeral hearses with the black horses.
We had one brother. Mm-hmm. You're coming out there, yeah. We had one brother who had this wonderful theory with regard to why the older Irish people saw the good people much more often than we do now. And his thing was, when you were coming home with a lantern or a lamp rather than in the fullness of light, that the especially when you were on horseback or on a cart or whatever, that the rhythm of the horse and the movement of the lantern actually brought you into an altered state of consciousness. And that it was like being kind of self-hypnotized almost in a way. And because of this, it sort of opened up. And as he said, particularly helpful was the fact that you were probably on the way back from the pub as well. So now he wasn't saying that they were drunk or hallucinating, but that, you know, the combination of these elements together made it much more easy for you to see what was accompanying you on the road or what was taking an interest.
Yeah, because the playing with lights is true. Yeah, because there's African tribes that do this kind of stuff with the lights. I think that they would like literally kind of lay down in front of the sun, and they do this kind of weird filtery kind of thing with their fingers and waving back and forward to kind of create this pattern. And then I think people, I'm not sure who exactly. My dad actually did try and build on basically a light machine, which was like, it was on a turntable. And it had carved like grooves or holes in it. And it was this big cylindrical piece of cardboard you'd stick on the turntable, but basically it would rotate and you'd get a kind of a similar effect. So yeah, the playing with the light, I think even that concept is definitely something.
It's funny, yeah, because I told a story on the podcast years ago. We have our own, you know, the little ghost stories we'd have from childhood. So I remember being a small kid playing the Game Boy, and I've told this a couple of times. So I was playing the Turtles. I remember the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles video game. Someone had given me a lend from. I was about 7 or 8. And it was without that big brick Game Boy, and
best ever.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good. But I was playing it for ages, and eventually I turned it off, and I was just playing with the light with my eyes, you know. I was 7 or 8 and I kind of blinking and you're seeing those black spots. And when I turned to my right, there was just a being of those black spots that was, you know, to me seemed like a man-sized thing standing near the bed. And I jumped through it and I ran to my parents who were in the sitting room. And I just said, for some reason, I didn't say, I just saw something scary or, you know, anything like that. And I just never told them. And then it sort of didn't happen again. Maybe one more other time many years later, but yeah, it was light. I'd never made the connection with the light until you guys were just chatting there now.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Just while I have you guys there, because I have it, I'm not sure if you can see this now on screen. Does that come out okay?
It does, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That is the statue.
Wow. Oh, that is amazing. Like, that looks like legit. You know, the way sometimes you see those African carvings of elephants and stuff like that. Yeah. Like, that looks really detailed as well. That's amazing.
Wow.
That was carved out of one piece of
That's
wood.
Amazing. The craftsmanship in it is really good. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
So YouTube viewers will actually be able to see that. So tune in on YouTube and check out that image. It's fantastic.
There you go. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll send on the link to Carl's article on the piece. Yeah.
So what we'll do, Brother Richard, before we go, is have you got any, I suppose, a spooky tale or an anecdote or anything like that for our listeners as we get into Halloween?
So seeing as we're talking about, consciousnesses that can become physical or semi-physical along the way, I suppose one of the things that people maybe might like to have a little more think about is the whole idea of imaginary friends. Mm-hmm. It's amazing how often we get called out when imaginary friends suddenly aren't very imaginary anymore.
Oh, okay.
And there was a gentleman some years ago wrote a fantastic book, very, very underknown within the kind of paranormal world. I'd encourage anybody to read it. A guy called Mike Hallowell, wonderful name for Halloween. Hallowell. He's an English investigator, but he coined the phrase quasi-corporeal companions for imaginary friends. Quasi-corporeal companions. And he divides them into different kinds. But my particular experience of dealing with this was a house we were called to, and was a relation of one of the brothers here. And so he got in touch with me to say, they're having a few little problems. They'd moved into a new house. It was a terraced house, block of terraced houses, a young couple with a daughter who was about 4 or 5 at the time. And everything was fine, lovely new house, and they were beginning to kind of gut the house, a lot of work to be done, first kind of big home, etc. Anyway, the little girl, they would notice, was sort of laughing and chatting away to herself in her room, and then when the parents would walk in, it was kind of like all quiet, nobody there, and eventually they were sort of saying to her, "Who are you talking to?" And she kept talking about her new friend. And eventually her mum said, "Look, tell me about your new friend." So she drew on a page like a typical old man in like a brown coat and a flat cap hat. And she said, who is he? She said, I don't know his name. He's just the man in the brown coat. So that was the man in the brown coat. That was fine. And she just talked for a while, and the mother brought it up with, family members and things like that. And they said, oh, look, they've just moved house. It's a young kid. She's no friends. This is the imaginary friend thing. Don't be worried about it. It'll all disappear as she gets to know new friends. Anyway, it didn't disappear, and it kept going. And they would notice at night they'd be in the lounge kind of watching TV or whatever, and the little girl would be there sitting down playing, and suddenly she'd go quiet and she'd follow kind of from one side of the room to the other, and then she'd go back to playing. And they'd say, what are you looking at? And she'd say, oh, the man in the brown coat just walked by. So it began to freak the dad out, and eventually he was saying to her, look, there is no man in the brown coat, stop talking about it, whatever. And she would just say, well, he's right behind you and he's laughing. Oh, wow. And at that stage, the dad was totally freaked out and was kind of, leave it alone with her. Anyway, the renovation of the house continues until they begin to change. The landing of the house had a couple of bedrooms, and there was a large alcove. And in the alcove, from the previous owners, etc., to being there, was one of these fitted in tall boy chest of drawers. Those big, long, tall, and stuff like that. So anyway, the mother didn't like it, wanted to move it, wanted to knock through the archway into the rooms. Lots of, new kind of design ideas, etc., for this house. And when they started talking about it, the little girl piped up and she was like, oh, the man in the brown coat doesn't want you to change that. And she was like, ignore the kid, forget about it. The kid kept saying, I'm telling you, like, he really doesn't want you to change that. He built that. You're not to change that. So anyway, the night came, and they uncoupled from the wall this big chest of drawers, and they shoved it out onto the landing to be taken away by removal people the following day. And the little girl woke them up in huge distress, saying that the man in the brown coat was in her room, and he was really angry, and he was shouting at her and saying how disrespectful they'd been to the house, and that they needed to leave the chest of drawers where it was, whatever. So the mother sat up in the bed, and being tired and being worn out, said to the girl, for the last time, there is no man in the brown coat. You are to go back to bed, and I don't want to hear another word about it. And outside, the big chest of drawers shifted back into the alcove.
No.
Oh. So at that point, they called us. And we got the background story, and I went out with the brother who was the relative of them, because it was kind of easier to do that. And they asked us to come in the evening because it was dark, and they didn't want people to see bugs calling to the house and things like that. And we're used to that, so we arrived out. And lovely little girl, lovely house, lovely atmosphere in it. But the moment we started talking to them, there was just this kind of atmosphere of, like, the whole house seemed to be listening. It was just that experience of everything. It was like attention had kind of turned in. So we were asking all about about it. So I was chatting to the little girl, and I said to her, is the man in the brown coat here now? And she was like, yeah, he's over there. I said, okay, that's grand. I said, why do you call him the man in the brown coat? And she was like, because he's a man in a brown coat. That makes sense. But I said, have you ever asked him his name? And she said, no. Well, I said, ask him his name. So she asked the name, and she listened for a while, and she told us the name. And I said to the parents, does that name mean anything to you? And they're like, absolutely nothing. I said, okay, it's not a granddad, it's not a relative, it's nothing at all. So I said, fine, sometimes the names mean things, sometimes they don't. So we said, look, we need to address him now, so if you guys can all go into the next room. So we went into the next room, and we spoke to him, and we said, look, this isn't your house anymore. Mm-hmm. You can't be here anymore, and you need to move on. And tomorrow morning we will celebrate Mass for the repose of your soul. And we will ask the angels to come and to guide you into the next life. But you have to leave these people alone now. Mm-hmm. And the house kind of calmed a bit. And then we had to say, you are dead. Mm-hmm. You may not know you're dead, but you are actually dead. And it's time for you to move on. And above all, you have to go without causing any kind of damage or any kind of injury to these people. So the family came back into the kitchen, and we were sitting having a cup of tea, and the little girl was like, oh, he's sad. Mm. And we said, okay. And she said, he's quiet and he's sad. So as we were leaving, she told us that he had come to her to say goodbye. We said, okay. So the following morning we celebrated the mass back in the friary for him. And people often think it all has to happen there, but like time and space means nothing to this, you know. So we did it there. And we said, look, give us a call if anything comes back, if there's any other. Sometimes they need to be told a couple of times. All went quiet, all was fine, no more furniture moving by itself, house renovations continued fine. About a week later, the father was out at the bins and putting the bins out, and the next door neighbour was putting the bins out, who was an older man. And the older man, of course, said to him, I see you had 2 monks in the other night. And the poor man was mortified and said, oh, yeah, well, they're relatives of my wife. And he was like, oh, right, okay. I thought they were coming in to get rid of your ghost.
Right.
And he said, what do you mean? And he said, the fella who built the terrace of houses, he said he was an awful landlord and he was always on top of us about changing things. And when he died, it didn't change. He used to be in and out of the houses the whole time.
Oh, wow.
From house to house, basically haunting the different houses if they started to give out. And he said, the funny thing is, he said, we haven't seen him in a few days since your monks were in. The man said, well, no, we asked him to settle him. And that was it. So the next time your little one begins to say to you, you know, I have a new friend, it's good to take them seriously and to make sure that they're pleasant. This was a pleasant one. There are other ones that aren't as pleasant, and can sort of begin to leach into a family's energy and into a family system in that way. And then it's good to have kind of, you know, protections and blessings on houses in that way, just to kind of finish that off. But we forget that the little ones up to about the age of 6 or 7 exist. We talked about metaphysical. They are metaphysical. They exist between 2 worlds. They shift consciousness all of the time. They see things we don't.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that actually. Is you know, children seem to be so much more connected. That's the reason.
100%. There was a wonderful anthropologist, a guy called Lyle Watson. His works are not read as much as they should be. He wrote a book that is a primer for anybody in the paranormal world, and it's been almost forgotten about, and it's called The Secret Life of Inanimate Objects. It should be read by everybody who's into anything as this. He lived in Western Ireland he was American, but he lived in Western Ireland for most of his time. And he told a story many years ago of they were doing psychokinesis experiments with adults, you know, the very small PK effect adults are capable of. And he was told by a guy who heard about this, oh no, you need to meet my daughter. And eventually he met this young girl, and she had the ability she would throw a baseball or a tennis ball in the air, and there would be a pop, and the baseball or tennis ball would come down completely inside out. Sealed inside out. Which meant that every particle of matter had passed through itself to completely do that. And this was her party trick. Said to her, like she was doing this for her friends and parties and all the rest of it. And he was like, how did you, when, how, where, you know? And she just said, I was bored one day. And I just thought, I wonder what's inside a tennis ball. But I only had one tennis ball and I didn't want to wreck it. Like I didn't want to cut it open. So I just asked it to show me.
Wow.
She could do this repeatedly. And then he measured it. He did all of the kind of thing. She couldn't do it on camera, which was really interesting. But he had all the witnesses, he had all the people in the lab, everybody had seen her do it, couldn't do it on camera. After about 10 years or so, he met her as a teenager and he said to her, can you do the thing again? And she was like, oh no, that's impossible.
Okay.
What do you mean? And she said, well, I showed it to a teacher once and the teacher told me that's impossible. And I was never able to do it again after that.
That is food for thought. And as well, my brother had an imaginary friend for a year or two, and he was, as a kid, like he was seeing a person, so hearing, or an entity, I suppose. So hearing that is very interesting.
It's funny, yeah. My sister, same thing. She's coming on the podcast next Monday to tell the story. Very similar to your one there. An old man who seemed to be benevolent. It just attached itself to my niece when she was quite young, when she started sleeping in her own room, and but they got someone in to kind of help them out with it or whatever. But and she's only about to turn 6, so it's funny, she's just sort of exiting that metaphysical phase. I must bring her out on a hunt with me there actually before January.
Yeah, you wouldn't know what to turn up. And it's amazing how quickly the memories fade.
Yeah,
it's almost like there is a kind of, we talk about paranormal amnesia and all of that kind of stuff, but there is a thing. You meet a lot of people who will talk about, there was stuff. I remember there was stuff way back, but I can't grab it. And you're saying, well, that's fine.
It is a funny thing, because sometimes I try to think back about how I felt as a child, and I can get to my teenage years, but when you got to go further back, it's like you can only feel how it was to be a child through the lens of an adult. Do you know? It's like it's totally gone. That I have memories, but they don't have that certain je ne sais quoi that makes sense of it.
Yeah. Well.
We've got, before we go as well, we asked you before the episode if you had any kind of take on it, but it's just because it's a story in, I suppose it'd be a week prior as minifills now at this stage. But one of our listeners wrote in, Bob Gusky shouts out, and he had basically the story we were explaining before we went on air, where basically explained he's an Uber driver, kind of a lapsed Catholic in a sense, was wearing a crucifix, right?
Yeah, so he had a cross on a chain, and he had picked up a fare, and it was a lady. He didn't specify what religion she was, but they seemed to have quite a nice chat just about religion in general in the car. And he said that was relevant because it would be rare enough when you're picking up someone for Uber that you'd talk about that kind of stuff. But he said lapsed Catholic, and then kind of he made a point to just say, it's not like, I don't want to say getting back into it, but something like that, if that makes sense.
It was back on his radar a bit more.
I suppose so.
Sure.
Yeah.
And as they were talking, he noticed that the cross just came out of the chain somehow. So he obviously assumed it's gotten snagged on my clothes. There's the chain snapped. And after he pulled in anyway, dropped her off, he checked, and it surely had come off, but the chain was perfectly intact. There didn't seem to be any way that the cross could have come out. And he was just a bit, I suppose, beguiled by the whole thing.
Well, I suppose there's two possibilities come to mind that where we don't go near, it was just a bad chain. But I mean, if there's two possible. One is that the mere conversation, the fact that it's on his mind and he's chatting about it and all of that kind of stuff may have generated a very small PK event where it was a piece of matter associated with this passed through something else, and that can happen. I think we're surrounded by tiny PK effects most of the time, and most of us just, it's just like, oh, what, where that came from, and it's kind of, we move on with the busyness of life. There's a whole directory of these. I think the Fortean Society years ago just called them jots, which was just one of those things. We don't know where it came from. Don't know. It has no significance. It's just that. The second possibility, though, is that something may have just tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're looking at us, we're looking at you." Yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
And who knows in the end?
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to get your take on it. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? If Halloween, obviously, we're kind of in that little space at the moment. What would be your suggestion for a good Halloween movie?
Oh.
Brother Richard's going to say Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
No. I tell you, okay, if you really want something that's going to give you a feeling of the other, then I would say Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil.
Never seen that.
If you haven't come across that, it's a Clint Eastwood directed, Kevin Spacey starring tale of murder and possibly real magic and voodoo in New Orleans.
Oh, sounds interesting.
I feel like either my dad has this on DVD and that's where I feel like I'm close to this thing.
Well worth seeing. And if not that, then I think we can start again the ancient argument as to whether The Nightmare Before Christmas is actually a Halloween movie or a Christmas movie.
Yeah. I think you can get the same with Gremlins as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sure, leave it there. Brother Richard, thanks very much again for coming on. It was an amazing chat.
Appreciate it.
More than welcome. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege always. Okay. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Richard.
Take care.
Bye-bye.